If someone had asked me who I trusted most in this world, I would have given them two names: my wife, Rachel, and my best friend, Daniel. I never imagined those two people would eventually become the reason I couldn't sleep at night. Then one night, I saw Daniel's name appear on Rachel's phone. At first, I thought it was nothing, but maybe he needed to ask her something. Maybe it was about the weekend. But then I saw the message, and something about the way he had written it made me stop. It wasn't a love confession. There was nothing obvious enough to prove they were having an affair. But suddenly, I remembered all the little things I'd ignored. The private jokes, the messages, the way Daniel looked at Rachel when he thought I wasn't watching. And then I remembered something that scared me even more. Rachel had started turning her phone face down whenever I walked into the room. I could have confronted them that night. I could have asked Rachel why Daniel was sending her those messages. I could have asked Daniel what he really wanted from my wife. But I didn't. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, and I decided to watch them instead. What I discovered over the next few weeks would make me question everything I knew about my marriage and the man I had called my best friend for years.
If someone had asked me who I trusted most in this world, I would have given them two names without hesitation: my wife, Rachel, and my best friend, Daniel. Rachel was the woman I had promised to spend the rest of my life with. Daniel was the man who had stood beside me through the years when life seemed determined to knock me down. I had trusted him with things I had never told anyone else. I had trusted him around my home, around my family, and most importantly, around the woman I loved. If you had told me that one day I would sit alone in my own bedroom, staring at a message between those two people and wondering whether my entire marriage had been built on something I never understood, I would have laughed at you. But that night, I wasn't laughing. I was staring at Rachel's phone, reading a message from Daniel that wasn't openly romantic, wasn't an obvious confession, and technically wasn't proof of anything. But there was something about the words he had chosen, something too personal, too familiar, too intimate for a man who was supposed to be nothing more than my wife's friend. The message was short. That was what made it worse. Daniel didn't say that he loved her. He didn't ask her to leave me. He didn't write anything that could instantly expose him. Instead, he wrote something that sounded almost innocent on the surface, the kind of sentence another person might read and forget 5 minutes later. But I knew Daniel. I knew the way he spoke. I knew the way he joked. I knew the difference between a casual message and something carefully chosen. And suddenly, memories that I had ignored for months began coming back to me one after another. The way Daniel sometimes looked at Rachel when he thought I wasn't watching. The way Rachel seemed to become unusually quiet whenever Daniel and I were together. The private jokes I didn't understand. The conversations that seemed to stop whenever I entered the room. The times Daniel had somehow known what Rachel was feeling before I did. At the time, I had told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, this was my best friend. This was my wife. These were the two people I was supposed to trust most. But there are moments when your mind begins connecting things your heart desperately wants to keep separate. I read the message again. Then again. My hands were completely still, but inside, everything was moving. I remember thinking that there had to be an explanation. There had to be something I was missing. Maybe Daniel was simply being supportive. Maybe Rachel had told him something because she needed someone to talk to. Maybe I was exhausted and turning an ordinary conversation into something it wasn't. I wanted one of those explanations to be true because the alternative was too painful to even consider. If Daniel had feelings for Rachel, then every memory involving the three of us suddenly had another meaning. Every dinner, every holiday, every late-night conversation, every time I had left the two of them alone together because I trusted them completely. And if Rachel knew about those feelings, then I wasn't just looking at a problem with my best friend. I was looking at a problem inside my marriage. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next wasn't a simple story about a man discovering that another man found his wife attractive. Feelings happen. People develop attachments they never expected. That alone doesn't make someone a monster. What mattered was what happened after those feelings appeared. What boundaries were crossed. What conversations were kept secret. And most importantly, what Rachel knew before I ever realized there was something I needed to know. Because when I finally looked back at the months leading up to that night, I discovered that the message on her phone wasn't the beginning of the story. It was only the first piece of evidence I was finally willing to see. I should have confronted them that night. Instead, I put the phone back exactly where I found it. And that decision would cost me weeks of pretending everything was normal. If someone had asked me who I trusted most in this world, I would have given them two names without hesitation. My wife, Rachel, and my best friend, Daniel. Rachel was the woman I had chosen to build my life with, and Daniel was the man who had been beside me long before Rachel and I ever met. For years, I never thought those two relationships could possibly collide. Daniel knew everything about me. He knew the mistakes I had made, the things I was afraid of, the dreams I had quietly given up on, and the parts of my life I rarely discussed with anyone. Rachel knew even more. She knew what I looked like when I was pretending to be fine, what I sounded like when something was bothering me, and how to tell when I needed silence instead of advice. In my mind, these two people represented two completely different kinds of trust. One was my marriage. The other was friendship. I never imagined that one day I would have to question both at exactly the same time. Daniel and I had known each other for years, and our friendship had survived the kind of changes that usually separate people. Jobs came and went. Relationships changed. Friends moved away. Some people we knew simply disappeared from our lives. But Daniel remained. He was the person I called when something good happened, and the person I called when something went wrong. When Rachel and I got married, Daniel was there. He wasn't just another guest standing somewhere in a crowd. He was one of the people I wanted beside me, because I considered him family. Rachel liked him too, which made everything easier. There was never any awkwardness between them, at least not that I could see. The three of us would have dinner together, talk for hours, joke about old stories, and sometimes spend entire weekends together with other friends. Looking back, there were moments I probably should have paid closer attention to. But when you trust someone completely, you don't examine their behavior the way you would examine a stranger's. You give them the benefit of the doubt before you even realize you're doing it. The first thing that changed wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no shocking confession, and no obvious betrayal. It was simply that Daniel began becoming more present in our lives. At first, I thought it was because he had more free time. He would stop by the house unexpectedly. Sometimes he would call Rachel directly to ask about plans we had already discussed together. He started remembering little details about her schedule, things I hadn't even realized he had been told. One evening, Rachel mentioned that she had been thinking about changing something at work, and Daniel immediately knew what she was talking about. I looked at him and asked how he knew. He laughed and said she had mentioned it before. I didn't think much of it. Why would I? Daniel was my best friend. Rachel was my wife. There is nothing suspicious about two people who knew each other while remembering things about each other's lives. At least, that's what I told myself. But sometimes the things we dismiss as insignificant become important only after we discover what they were connected to. There were other moments too. Daniel seemed to notice Rachel's mood almost instantly. If she was quiet, he would ask what was wrong. If she looked tired, he would comment on it. If she laughed at something he said, he seemed to hold on to that moment longer than necessary. None of this was enough to accuse anyone of anything. In fact, if I had described those moments to someone else, they probably would have told me I was imagining things. And maybe I was. That was the problem. I couldn't tell whether I was noticing genuine changes or simply becoming sensitive to ordinary interactions. I didn't want to become the husband who watched his wife every time she spoke to another man. I didn't want to become suspicious of my closest friend simply because he was comfortable around her. So every time something felt slightly unusual, I found an explanation for it. Daniel was naturally friendly. Rachel was naturally open. They had known each other for years. There was nothing wrong with that. At least, there wasn't supposed to be. Then came the evening that changed everything. Rachel and I had been home for the night. She had fallen asleep earlier than usual, and I was still awake, moving around the house quietly because I wasn't tired. Her phone was on the nightstand when it vibrated. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't checking her phone. I wasn't searching for evidence. The screen simply lit up in the darkness, and Daniel's name appeared. I remember seeing it and thinking that it was probably nothing. Maybe he needed to ask something about the weekend. Maybe he had forgotten something. I could have ignored it completely. But then the preview appeared on the screen, and I saw enough words to make me stop. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an obvious declaration of love. There was nothing in that message that could immediately prove an affair. But the way Daniel had written it felt different. It sounded personal, familiar, almost as though he was speaking to someone he had become emotionally close to. I stared at the screen for several seconds, trying to convince myself that I was misunderstanding what I was reading. I picked up the phone, and that was the moment I crossed a line of my own. I knew I shouldn't. I knew the privacy of a marriage mattered, but fear has a way of making principles feel less important than answers. I opened the message. What I saw didn't immediately tell me what was happening. In fact, the lack of anything obvious made it more disturbing. Daniel wasn't saying, "I love you." He wasn't asking Rachel to meet him somewhere. Instead, he was talking about something she had apparently told him earlier. He knew she had been struggling with something at work. He knew she had been upset that afternoon. He knew something had happened that I hadn't heard about. Then he wrote something that made my stomach tighten. "You know you can always talk to me. I don't want you carrying everything alone." It could have been innocent. A good friend might say exactly that. But then I remembered something Rachel had told me earlier that week. She had said she was fine. She had looked me directly in the eyes and told me there was nothing bothering her. Yet here was Daniel, apparently aware that something was wrong. I read the message again, searching for some innocent explanation that would make the feeling in my chest disappear. There was another message beneath it, and then another. Nothing explicit, nothing that would stand up as proof in a courtroom. But together, they painted a picture I had never noticed before. Daniel had become someone Rachel confided in, and apparently, that had been happening without me knowing. That realization hurt more than the words themselves. It wasn't simply that my best friend was talking to my wife. It was that my wife had been telling my best friend things she wasn't telling me. I suddenly wondered how many conversations had happened before that night. How many times had Daniel listened to Rachel when I wasn't around? How many times had she reached for her phone and contacted him instead of me? And the question that frightened me most was one I didn't want to ask. Why? I put the phone down and walked away. I remember standing in the hallway, looking at the bedroom door, knowing Rachel was only a few feet away. I could have woken her up. I could have asked her who Daniel was to her. I could have demanded an explanation. But instead, I stood there thinking about everything that could happen if I was wrong. What if I accused my wife of something she hadn't done? What if I destroyed my friendship because I had misunderstood a few messages? What if Daniel really was only trying to help her? And what if the truth was exactly what I was beginning to fear? Those questions fought against each other until I realized there was no answer I could get that night without changing something permanently. So I made a decision that seemed easier in that moment. I would say nothing. I would watch. I would wait. I would find out whether there was actually something happening before I accused the two people I trusted most. That decision changed the way I looked at everything. The next morning, Rachel woke up and behaved as though nothing had happened. She kissed me, asked about my plans for the day, and went about her morning routine. I watched her carefully, wondering whether she knew that I had seen the message. She didn't appear nervous. She didn't look guilty. She didn't act differently at all. And somehow, that made me feel even more confused. Later that day, Daniel called me. His voice sounded completely normal. He asked how I was doing, joked about something we had talked about earlier, and then casually asked how Rachel was. It was such an ordinary question that I almost laughed at myself for being suspicious. But then he paused and asked, "Is she okay?" I didn't tell him what I had seen. Instead, I said she was fine. There was another pause. Then Daniel said, Good. She didn't seem like herself yesterday. I remember going completely silent because I hadn't told him that Rachel had been upset. I hadn't told him she was struggling. I hadn't even known she was struggling. Yet Daniel did. That was the first moment I realized the message on the phone might not have been an isolated conversation. There might have been an entire relationship between them that existed just outside my view. And suddenly, I began remembering every time Daniel had been around Rachel without me. Every time he had offered to help her with something. Every time they had laughed together. Every time I'd walked into a room and their conversation had stopped. Maybe none of those moments meant anything. Maybe they were simply two people who had become close friends through their connection to me. But if that was all it was, why had I never known how close they had become? For the next several days, I said nothing. I went to work. I came home. I had dinner with my wife. I answered Daniel's calls. I laughed at his jokes. I acted exactly as I had always acted because I was terrified that one wrong question would expose something I wasn't ready to face. But inside, I was changing. I started paying attention. And once I started paying attention, I noticed details I had never seen before. Rachel began keeping her phone closer. Daniel started sending messages at times when he knew I was working. Their conversations weren't necessarily inappropriate, but there seemed to be more of them, more private moments, more things I wasn't part of. And then, one evening, I saw Daniel look at Rachel across the dinner table. It lasted only a second, maybe less, but this time I didn't look away. I watched him watching her, and for the first time, I wondered whether Daniel wasn't simply being friendly. I wondered whether my best friend had fallen in love with my wife. And if he had, the question that frightened me most wasn't whether he had feelings for her. It was whether Rachel already knew. After that night, I began noticing things I had previously ignored. It wasn't that Rachel suddenly became a different person. If anything, she seemed exactly the same. She still made coffee in the morning, still asked about my day, still laughed at the stupid things I said, and still kissed me before leaving the house. That normality was almost unbearable because I was carrying a secret she didn't know I was carrying. Every ordinary moment had become a question. When her phone buzzed, I wondered who had messaged her. When she smiled at the screen, I wondered why. When Daniel called, I listened carefully to his voice, searching for something hidden underneath his words. I hated what I was becoming. I didn't want to be suspicious. I didn't want to monitor my wife. I didn't want to question every interaction between two people I had trusted completely. But once doubt enters a relationship, it doesn't need much evidence to survive. Sometimes one unanswered question is enough to keep you awake at night. A few days later, Daniel came over for dinner. Normally, his visits felt effortless. We would sit around the kitchen, talk about work, laugh about old memories, and eventually end up discussing whatever was happening in our lives. That evening was different, although nobody said anything was wrong. Daniel seemed unusually interested in Rachel's plans for the following weekend. He asked whether she was still attending an event with some of her coworkers. Rachel said she wasn't sure. Daniel remembered the exact date and even asked what time she expected to leave. I looked at him. He noticed me looking and immediately shifted the conversation toward me. It was a tiny moment, almost meaningless, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why did he remember her schedule so well? More importantly, why did I suddenly feel like I was the outsider in a conversation involving my own wife? Rachel noticed my silence and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said yes. That answer was becoming easier to give and harder to believe. That night, after Daniel left, I finally asked Rachel about him. I tried to sound casual. I asked whether they had been talking more recently. She looked at me for a moment before answering. Then she said they had spoken a few times because Daniel had been checking on her. I asked what he was checking on her about. She hesitated. It wasn't a long hesitation, but it was long enough for me to notice. She eventually told me that work had been stressful and that she had been frustrated about some things. I asked why she hadn't told me. She said she didn't want to bring more stress into my life because I had been busy too. It was a reasonable explanation, a loving explanation, even. But something about it still bothered me. I told her she could always talk to me. She smiled and said she knew that. Then she changed the subject. I let her. But later that night, while she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered whether she had changed the subject because she was hiding something. The next morning, Daniel called. I almost didn't answer. When I finally did, he sounded completely relaxed. He asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. I agreed. I didn't tell him why. When we sat across from each other, I watched him carefully. He looked exactly like the man I had known for years. Same voice, same jokes, same expressions. It was almost frustrating. I wanted him to look guilty because guilt would have made everything easier. Instead, he looked at me and asked how my marriage was going. I told him it was fine. Then he asked whether Rachel was happy. That question stopped me. I looked at him and asked why he wanted to know. He shrugged and said he cared about both of us. I told him I appreciated that. Then I asked whether there was anything I should know about the conversations he had been having with Rachel. For the first time, I saw something change in his face. It was quick. His eyes moved away from mine. Then he looked back and said, "No, nothing you need to worry about." I wanted to believe him. I really did. Daniel had been my best friend for too long for me to immediately assume the worst. But his answer had created another problem. He hadn't asked what conversations I was referring to. He hadn't said, "What conversations?" He immediately knew exactly what I meant. That small detail stayed with me after we left the coffee shop. On the drive home, I kept replaying his response. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe he simply knew Rachel and I had talked about him. Maybe Rachel had mentioned my concerns. But there was another possibility, one I didn't want to entertain. Daniel knew there was something I didn't know. And if that was true, then I needed to understand what it was before confronting anyone again. I decided not to ask more questions. Instead, I would wait. I would let the truth reveal itself. At least, that was the plan. Over the following week, the distance between Rachel and me became harder to ignore. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no screaming arguments or accusations. The change happened quietly. I began holding things back because I didn't know what was safe to say. Rachel began noticing that I was quieter, and whenever she asked what was wrong, I told her I was tired. Meanwhile, Daniel continued behaving as though nothing had changed. He called me regularly. He invited me to watch a game with him. He sent jokes to our group chat. From the outside, everything looked normal. But I had started living two versions of my life. In one version, Daniel was my oldest friend and Rachel was my wife. In the other, I was watching both of them, waiting for one of them to make a mistake. And the more I watched, the more I realized how easy it was for people to hide something when the person they're hiding it from trusts them completely. Then something happened that I couldn't explain away. Rachel received another message from Daniel while we were sitting together. I wasn't trying to look at her phone, but she saw the notification and immediately turned the screen downward. It was a tiny movement, something anyone could do without thinking. But I saw it. She had never done that before. I asked who it was. She said it was Daniel. I asked what he wanted. She said it wasn't important. Then she picked up the phone and walked into another room. I sat there alone, listening to the sound of her footsteps disappearing down the hallway. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether something was happening. I was wondering what she didn't want to see. When she came back, I didn't ask again. I simply watched her sit down beside me. She smiled and asked what we should have for dinner. I smiled back, but inside, something had broken. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rachel was beside me, breathing quietly, completely unaware of the thoughts running through my head. I kept thinking about Daniel. Then I remembered something from several months earlier. There had been a family gathering, and Daniel had offered to help Rachel clean up after dinner. I had jokingly told them they were becoming quite a team. At the time, Rachel laughed. Daniel laughed too. But now I remembered the way he had looked at her immediately afterward. I remembered how Rachel suddenly became quiet. Another memory followed. Daniel once told me that Rachel was different from most people. I had taken it as a compliment. Now I wondered what he had meant. Then another memory. He had once told me that I was lucky to have her. That was true. Of course it was true. But suddenly, I heard the sentence differently. I began wondering whether Daniel had been telling me something without ever having the courage to say it directly. The following Friday, I came home earlier than expected. I didn't tell Rachel I was coming back early. When I opened the front door, I heard voices in the kitchen. It was Rachel and Daniel. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were simply talking. But when they heard me, the conversation stopped. Rachel looked surprised. Daniel looked uncomfortable. I asked what they were talking about. Rachel immediately said they were discussing something about work. Daniel nodded. I looked at both of them. I didn't accuse them. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked, "Why did you stop talking when I walked in?" Neither of them answered immediately. Daniel eventually laughed and said I was imagining things. Rachel told me I was being overly suspicious. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was letting fear turn ordinary moments into evidence. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore anymore. I had walked into that kitchen expecting to see my wife and my best friend. Instead, for one brief moment, it felt like I had walked into a conversation that wasn't meant for me. That evening, after Daniel left, Rachel confronted me. She asked why I had been acting strangely. I finally admitted that I had noticed how often she and Daniel were talking. I didn't accuse her of cheating. I didn't even mention the message I had seen. I simply asked whether there was anything between them that I needed to know about. Rachel stared at me for several seconds. Then she said, "No, just one word. No explanation. No anger. No attempt to convince me." Somehow, that answer made me more uncomfortable than a long defense would have. I asked if she was sure. She said yes. Then she asked why I didn't trust her. I wanted to say that I did trust her. That was the problem. I trusted her so much that discovering a reason not to felt like losing part of myself. I told her I was sorry. She hugged me. I hugged her back. And for a moment, I almost believed everything was okay. Then, 2 days later, I made a discovery that changed the entire situation. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't searching through Rachel's phone. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she left her laptop open. A message notification appeared on the screen. Daniel's name was there. I froze. And this time, the message contained a sentence that could no longer be dismissed as simple friendship. It said, "I shouldn't feel this way about you." I stared at those words for what felt like an eternity. And suddenly, every unanswered question had found a terrifying new direction. Because now I knew Daniel had feelings for Rachel. What I didn't know was whether Rachel had feelings for him too. I stared at Daniel's message until the words almost stopped looking real. "I shouldn't feel this way about you." 6 words. That's all it took to turn months of uncertainty into something I could no longer explain away. I didn't know exactly what Daniel meant, but I knew enough. He wasn't talking about friendship. He wasn't talking about my marriage. He was talking about Rachel, my wife, the woman sleeping beside me every night, the woman I had promised to trust. And suddenly, the person I had been afraid of becoming became the person I was. Suspicious, angry, hurt, afraid. I closed the laptop and sat there for several minutes without moving. I thought about confronting Rachel immediately, but another thought stopped me. What if she already knew? What if Daniel had told her how he felt and she had kept it from me? And what if that message wasn't the first time he had admitted it? The possibility made my stomach turn. I waited until Daniel and I were alone before I confronted him. I didn't tell him everything I had seen. I simply asked him a question. "Do you have feelings for Rachel?" He looked at me, and for several seconds he said nothing. That silence was my answer before he ever spoke. He lowered his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he admitted it. He said he had tried to ignore the feelings. He said he knew they were wrong. He said he had never planned for them to happen. According to him, it started gradually during conversations with Rachel when she was going through a difficult period. She had trusted him with things she wasn't comfortable discussing with me, and over time, he had become emotionally attached to her. He insisted that he had never intended to betray me. He said he hated himself for feeling that way. But none of those explanations made the pain disappear. I looked at the man who had been my best friend for years and realized that he had been carrying feelings for my wife while sitting across from me, shaking my hand, laughing with me, and telling me everything was fine. I asked him a question I had been afraid to ask since the beginning. Does Rachel know? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked away, rubbed his hands together, and finally said, "She knows I care about her." I asked him what that meant. He said Rachel knew his feelings had become complicated. He claimed he had never asked her to leave me and never told her that she should choose him. But he admitted that there had been conversations between them about his feelings. I felt as though the room had become smaller. Rachel knew. She had known that my best friend was developing feelings for her, and she hadn't told me. I asked Daniel why she would keep something like that from me. He said he didn't know. Maybe she was afraid of hurting me. Maybe she didn't want to destroy our friendship. Maybe she didn't know how to handle it. But none of those answers changed what I was feeling. For months, I had been living inside a marriage where two people knew something about my life that I didn't. I went home that evening with one question burning inside my mind. How long has Rachel known? When I walked through the door, she immediately noticed something was wrong. She asked if I was okay. I looked at her and realized that I couldn't pretend anymore. I asked her whether Daniel had ever told her that he had feelings for her. She became completely still. She didn't deny it. She didn't ask why I was asking. She simply looked down. That was enough. I asked how long she had known. She finally admitted that Daniel had told her some time earlier. She said she didn't know how to respond because she never wanted to encourage him. She said she had tried to create distance, but she didn't want to humiliate him or destroy the friendship between the three of us. I asked her why she hadn't told me. She said she was afraid of what I would think. I asked her whether she loved him. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "No." But then came the sentence that hurt more than anything she had said before. She admitted that she had developed an emotional closeness with him that she knew she should have handled differently. That was the moment I realized the problem wasn't simply that Daniel had fallen in love with my wife. The real problem was that boundaries had disappeared slowly, almost invisibly. Rachel hadn't woken up one morning and decided to betray me. Daniel hadn't planned years in advance to take my wife away. Instead, they had talked. They had shared things. They had become comfortable with each other. And somewhere along the way, a line had been crossed. Maybe neither of them knew exactly when it happened. Maybe that's how these situations begin. Not with a dramatic decision, but with small choices that feel harmless at the time. A private conversation. A message that should have been shared with a spouse instead. A secret kept because telling the truth seemed too difficult. And then another secret. And another. By the time someone finally asks what happened, the people involved can't even point to one exact moment when everything changed. I asked Rachel whether she had ever encouraged Daniel's feelings. She said no. I asked whether she had ever imagined being with him. She hesitated. That hesitation destroyed something inside me. Eventually, she admitted that there had been a moment when she wondered what life would have been like if circumstances had been different. She insisted that she never wanted to leave me and never planned to be with Daniel. But she couldn't honestly say she had never thought about it. I sat across from my wife, listening to a truth I had never wanted to hear. It wasn't a fair confession. It wasn't the kind of revelation people expect when they hear a story about betrayal. It was something more complicated. Rachel had remained physically committed to our marriage, but emotionally, she had allowed another man to occupy a space that should have been protected. And Daniel had allowed himself to become that person, knowing exactly who she was married to. Then I asked Rachel the question that had been haunting me since I first saw Daniel's message. If you didn't feel the same way about him, why didn't you cut him off? She started crying. She said she was afraid. Not afraid of Daniel, but afraid of what would happen if she completely ended the friendship. She said Daniel had been there during a difficult period when she felt lonely and misunderstood. She told me that she knew what he felt was wrong, but she also knew that he had become someone she relied on emotionally. She said she never wanted to replace me. Hearing that should have comforted me. Instead, it made me feel even worse, because I suddenly realized that while I had been working, paying bills, planning our future, and assuming my marriage was secure, my wife had been experiencing a kind of loneliness I hadn't noticed. And another man had been there to fill the silence. I couldn't sleep that night. Rachel stayed in the bedroom while I went downstairs. I sat alone in the dark, thinking about Daniel. I thought about all the times he had told me I was lucky to have Rachel. I thought about all the times he had defended our marriage when other people criticized it. I wondered whether he had genuinely been trying to help us, or whether part of him had been waiting for an opportunity. Then another possibility entered my mind. What if Daniel's feelings hadn't started recently? What if he had loved Rachel long before either of them admitted it? I remembered the first time I introduced them. I remembered how naturally they connected. I remembered how quickly Daniel became comfortable around her. At the time, I had been happy because my best friend and my future wife liked each other. Now, those same memories felt completely different. I didn't know what was real anymore. The next morning, Daniel came to my house. I hadn't invited him. He said he wanted to apologize. I let him inside because part of me still needed answers. He told me he was sorry for allowing his feelings to grow. He said he should have stepped away the moment he realized what was happening. He admitted that he had crossed emotional boundaries, even though he claimed nothing physical had happened between them. I asked him whether he had ever imagined a future with Rachel. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "I tried not to." That wasn't the answer I wanted. I asked again. He finally admitted that there had been moments when he imagined what life might have looked like if Rachel were with him. Then he said something that I would never forget. "I knew she loved you. That's what made me feel worse." I looked at him and asked why he stayed close to us if he knew how he felt. He said he didn't know how to walk away from the people who had become his family. But I wasn't ready to forgive him. I wasn't even ready to understand him. Because love doesn't erase responsibility. Feelings may appear without permission, but what someone does with those feelings is a choice. Daniel could have created distance. He could have told me. He could have told Rachel that continuing their private conversations was inappropriate. Instead, he stayed close. And Rachel had choices too. She could have told me the moment she realized Daniel's feelings were becoming serious. She could have established stronger boundaries. Instead, she kept the secret because she believed silence would protect everyone. But silence hadn't protected anyone. It had simply given the situation more time to grow. Then Daniel told me there was something I didn't know. He said the message I had discovered wasn't the first time he had admitted his feelings to Rachel. There had been another conversation. And according to Daniel, Rachel had said something in that conversation that she had never told me. Something that could change the way I understood the entire situation. I looked at him and asked, "What did she say?" Daniel hesitated. Then he gave me the answer. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether my best friend loved my wife. The question was whether my wife had ever loved him back. Daniel's answer was not the one I expected. He told me that Rachel had never said she loved him. She had never promised him a future, never asked him to leave his life behind for her, and never told him that she wanted to be with him. But she had admitted something else. During one of their private conversations, Rachel had told Daniel that she understood why he had developed feelings for her, because during a difficult period in our marriage, she had also become emotionally attached to the comfort he provided. She said there had been moments when talking to him felt easier than talking to me. She said she knew that was dangerous, and she knew she should have stopped it sooner. But she insisted that she never stopped loving me. Hearing those words created a strange kind of pain because they didn't give me the clean answer I wanted. There was no simple villain and no perfect victim. There were three people who had made choices, and every one of those choices had consequences. I asked Daniel why he was telling me this now. He said because I deserved to know everything, even if the truth destroyed whatever remained of our friendship. He told me that he had spent months convincing himself that his feelings were harmless because he never physically touched Rachel or openly asked her to leave me. But eventually, he realized that emotional betrayal didn't require a physical relationship to cause damage. He had become someone Rachel depended on emotionally, and he had enjoyed being that person. That admission was difficult to hear because it was honest. Daniel wasn't trying to make himself look innocent anymore. He wasn't saying that circumstances forced him into it. He was admitting that he had made choices. He had answered private messages. He had encouraged conversations. He had listened to things that should have remained between a husband and wife. And every time he told himself it was harmless, he moved another step away from the friendship I thought we had. For several days, I barely spoke to Rachel. I didn't know what to say. Every conversation seemed to lead back to the same questions. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you continue talking to him? Why did you allow him to become the person you went to when you were hurting? Rachel didn't have answers that could repair everything immediately. She could only tell me that she was sorry. She admitted that she had handled the situation badly. She said she had been afraid that telling me would destroy the friendship and cause a crisis in our marriage. But I told her that keeping the secret had already done that. She had tried to protect our marriage by hiding the problem, yet the secrecy itself had become part of the betrayal. I told her that if she had come to me earlier, I would have been hurt, but at least I would have had the opportunity to understand what was happening. Instead, I discovered the truth through a message that was never meant for me. The hardest part was realizing that I wasn't completely innocent either. That didn't excuse what Daniel and Rachel had done, but it forced me to look honestly at my marriage. Rachel had told me that she had felt lonely during a period when I was constantly working and emotionally distracted. I remember that time. I remembered coming home exhausted, eating dinner, checking emails, and going to bed. I remembered telling myself that I was doing all of it for our future. I had been trying to provide stability, but somewhere along the way, I had confused providing for someone with being present for them. Rachel hadn't been asking for another man. She had been asking for me. I hadn't heard her. Daniel did, and that didn't make Daniel right. It simply explained how a door had opened that should never have remained open. Eventually, I told Daniel that our friendship was over. It wasn't something I said in anger. By then, the anger had become exhaustion. I told him that I couldn't look at him the way I used to. Too many memories had been changed by what I now knew. He apologized and said he understood. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He didn't ask me to give him another chance. He simply said that he was sorry for hurting me and for putting Rachel in a position she should never have been placed in. Then he left. I watched him walk away from the house, and for the first time in years, I realized I had no idea when I would ever see him again. There was no dramatic ending, no shouting, no fight, just the quiet ending of a friendship that I had once believed would last for the rest of our lives. My marriage, however, was a different story. Walking away from Rachel would have been easier if I had stopped loving her. But I hadn't. That was the part nobody could prepare me for. You can be deeply hurt by someone and still love them. You can lose trust in someone and still miss the person they used to be. You can know that someone made a terrible mistake and still remember all the good things they brought into your life. Rachel and I had years together that couldn't simply disappear because of one painful chapter. So instead of making an immediate decision about our future, we started talking. Really talking. For the first time in a long time, we stopped trying to win arguments and started trying to understand each other. Rachel told me what she had been feeling during those difficult months. I told her how betrayed I felt by the secrecy. We both admitted where we had failed. Trust didn't return quickly. There were days when I still questioned everything. If Rachel received a message, I wondered who it was. If she came home late, my mind created explanations before she had a chance to speak. I hated that version of myself. But rebuilding trust isn't about pretending the damage never happened. It's about creating enough honesty that eventually you no longer need to question every detail. Rachel understood that. She stopped communicating privately with Daniel. She became more open about her feelings. And I changed too. I started listening when she said something was wrong instead of assuming I could fix everything later. I learned that marriage isn't protected simply because two people love each other. Love matters, but boundaries matter too. Communication matters. Honesty matters. And sometimes the smallest secrets can create the largest distance between two people. Months passed. The intensity of the situation slowly faded. Daniel moved on with his life, and I eventually heard through mutual friends that he was doing okay. I never reached out. I wasn't trying to punish him. I simply understood that some relationships cannot return to what they were. There are moments in life when forgiveness and reconciliation become two different things. I could eventually forgive Daniel without allowing him back into my life. I could stop carrying anger without pretending that nothing had happened. That distinction helped me heal. And as for Rachel and me, we weren't magically fixed. We had difficult conversations. We had uncomfortable silences. We had moments when the past came back unexpectedly. But we also had moments when we laughed again, when we sat together without fear, and when I realized that perhaps our marriage could become stronger because we had finally confronted the things we had avoided. Looking back now, the message on Rachel's phone wasn't really the beginning of the story. It was simply the moment I could no longer ignore what had already been happening. The real story had started much earlier, in the small spaces between conversations, in the things we didn't say, and in the boundaries we assumed would never need to be discussed. Daniel didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray me. Rachel didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy our marriage. But both of them allowed a situation to continue after they realized it was becoming dangerous. And that's the lesson that stayed with me. Feelings can appear without permission. Attraction can happen unexpectedly. But what you do afterward is where responsibility begins. Today, I don't think about Daniel every day anymore. There was a time when his name could ruin an entire afternoon. Now, it is simply a chapter in my past. Rachel and I stayed together, but we had to build our relationship again from a different foundation. I learned that staying together isn't the same thing as pretending nothing happened. We had to acknowledge the damage before we could move beyond it. And perhaps the strangest part of the entire experience was discovering that the person I thought I needed to protect my marriage from wasn't the only problem. I also needed to protect my marriage from silence, emotional distance, assumptions, and the belief that love alone would automatically keep everything safe. My best friend fell in love with my wife. For a long time, I thought that was the worst thing that had happened to me. Eventually, I realized the deepest wound wasn't that another man had feelings for the woman I loved. It was that the two people I trusted most had created a private emotional world that I wasn't part of, while I continued believing everything was exactly as I'd left it. That realization changed how I understood trust. Trust isn't simply believing that someone would never hurt you. Trust is knowing that when something threatens the relationship, they'll tell you before it becomes a secret. And sometimes, the most painful betrayal isn't what someone does behind your back. It's what they choose not to tell you while you're standing right in front of them. If there is one thing I would want someone watching this story to remember, it is this: boundaries matter, even with people you trust, especially with people you trust, because betrayal rarely begins with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it begins with a conversation that feels harmless, then another, then a secret, then an emotional connection that neither person wants to admit has become too important. And by the time someone finally says, "This has gone too far," the damage may already be done. I learned that the hard way. I lost a friendship I thought would last forever. I nearly lost my marriage. And I spent months trying to understand how two people I loved could become the reason I questioned everything I believed about trust. But I also learned something else. People can make terrible mistakes and still have the opportunity to change. Marriages can be wounded and still survive. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. Sometimes forgiveness simply means deciding that what someone did to you will no longer control the rest of your life. Daniel will always be part of my history, but he no longer controls my present. Rachel and I still carry the memory of what happened, but we don't live inside it anymore. We chose honesty over silence, communication over assumptions, and rebuilding over pretending. And perhaps that was the only way forward. Because in the end, my best friend falling in love with my wife wasn't the story I thought I was living. I thought I was telling the story of how I lost a friend. Instead, I learned how fragile trust can be, how important emotional boundaries are, and how easily people can become distant while still living under the same roof. I learned that sometimes the people closest to you can hurt you, without ever intending to become your enemy. And I learned that if you want a relationship to survive, you cannot simply love someone and assume everything else will take care of itself. You have to communicate. You have to listen. You have to protect the boundaries you promise to respect. And above all, you have to be honest before a small secret becomes a life-changing discovery. So if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have tried to save the marriage after discovering that your spouse knew your best friend was in love with them? Would you have ended the friendship immediately? Or would you have walked away from both relationships because the trust was too badly damaged? There may not be one right answer. Every marriage is different. Every friendship is different. But one thing is certain. Sometimes the hardest betrayal isn't discovering that someone else wanted what you had. It's discovering that the people you trusted most knew something was wrong and decided you were the last person who needed to know.